everybody, welcome to my channel for a new video. I had a new topic I wanted to cover since the last point update. As you noticed, there were a couple of changes to the magic face, and I think it's quite interesting because we heard at the beginning after the update a lot of people saying like, yeah, I want to spam this, spam that, the master, it's over, I want to play another setup. And yeah, I did also myself a couple of I thought a little bit about the possible options for my two armies that I play, and I wanted to share with you some of the idea that I had in relation to that, and I thought it might be interesting for you to follow it. So what did change? First of all, we have cheaper apprentice and we have more expensive adept and masters. We have unmodified conclave, which is also something interesting because it makes conclave in comparison to adepts mostly better for the point that you pay. So this is also quite interesting. I think conclave might see a bit more use in some armies, but they were already quite well used because conclave are quite strong. They have the option to force some spell sometimes without caring too much, because if you lose the champion, it doesn't cost you too many points. And the main question was, do we continue in some armies, do we continue to play masters, or do we go for small mage spam? And like I said, I heard a lot of crazy ideas, so obviously I think this video will not relate to everybody. Maybe it doesn't affect all army the same, but I try to use a couple of examples from Ogre Khan, Infernal Dwarfs, and also some other army. Try to show you a little bit examples and how does this thought process apply to different army. But I think what we need not to forget is when you pick multiple small casters, the fact that you don't have access anymore to spell 5 and 6. And there is a reason why they are spell 5 and 6. They are usually, at least one of them is very, very good to take. So definitely I think it's not, for me it would be wrong to just say, okay, master are too expensive at the moment, let's do something else, and I don't care if I lose this spell. You need really to think about it carefully and consider what you're losing when not picking a master. What do I want for my magic setup? So this is a general aspect. In my opinion, what you're looking for is like 3 buffs and 3 range damage, so to be effective at range and also to be effective in close combat. Obviously there are also spells that are useful at range and in CC. You can think about maybe Breast Weapon from Thaumaturgy, also Smite the Unbeliever. When you have a shooty army, you like to reduce the toughness from distance, but then in close combat it's also a very good buff. So spell like that can have two usage. They can be useful at range, they can be useful as a buff. So that's what you're targeting, I think, with your magical setup. And also with 5 to 6 spell, it's usually quite effective, since it will use, if you have a good balance between range damage or spell that are useful at range and spell that are useful in combat, you have a good way to spend your dice during the magic phase. How much to invest? This is a key question. You need to keep in mind the fact that if you invest too much in magic, then you have less unit on the board. So I think if you invest a lot in magic, you have to have a good reason to do it. Without that, you have the risk to have invested too much in something that won't have a big impact, and you will have less unit on the board, meaning at risk to lose board control, not be good enough in combat, and so on and so on. So what I'm usually looking for is an effective magic, meaning be sure that the point that I invest in, what can I say, it's not, I'm looking for a word to explain that properly, but it's static magic. It's mainly what are the points that I pay purely for spell casting, not considering combatability, stuff like that, really thinking purely about what are the points that I'm paying for the magic, and that needs to be effective. Because if you take a look at Fighting Mage, for example, this one that I've been playing in the past, that is quite expensive, as you can see, but basically you need to take into account the fact that you're paying almost half of the point for a monster that can fly and that is really good in combat. So I think there are Fighting Mage are an exception to that, to this calculation of how much do I want to invest, because you need to keep in mind that they have other purposes that only spell casting, and even in this case you need to take into account, for example, the value added from the mount to the lore being more effective. But I think don't forget as well that if you lose this model because they have other purposes that only spell casting, meaning you will take more risk with them than what you might do with a usual mage that will be in one of your units and that you will play more carefully, that has some protection against range damage and stuff like that. It's basically, if you lose a piece like that, that's the end of your magic phase. More, you won't do anything else. Magic is over basically, because that's too many points that a Wizard Master, and if you pick a model like that, usually you don't have many points left to pick a big mage, so you will only have like a support caster. For example, I played the Conjurer with him as a support caster. That worked quite well together. But then if I lose him, basically, yeah, I only have 2 spells left, so my magic phase is almost over. So I think you need to keep that in mind if you try to go for fighty mage. I think for me they work well, but only if they are a nice addition to your magical setup. Meaning, for example, I have a Wizard Master of Pyro in a bunker, stuff like that, that is safe. Okay, then I know that I will have these 4 or 5 spells that I decided to pay for, and then in addition to that, to have a bit more all-around magic phase. Or maybe, I don't think Pyro is the best example, but maybe Alchemy, because you have a mix between some damage and buffs. And then I could add, for example, I don't know, a small mage on a chariot with an Apprentice Pyro or Adept Pyro, or 2 mages on 2 chariot with Apprentice Pyro, to just add some nice touch to the magic, some additional range damage to, yeah, be a bit more all-around type of magic phase. But then if I lose them because they have other purposes than only spell casting, my magic phase is not over. I think that's something to keep in mind. And if that, for the example of a very expensive caster like that one, who is also the main caster, then you know that you need to play with him carefully, because you need to keep in mind that if you lose him, usually you lose a lot. Sometimes the game, and sometimes you lose at least a lot of points, and also your magic phase, which, yeah, 2 of them together is quite a lot. I have a couple of examples that I wanted to talk with you. So the first one is the one that I considered when building my new list for the new year. I wanted to have a look at what can I build to have a good amount of spell, but then to split in 2 mage in comparison to Wizard Master. And then if you check, that's the one that I went for. So I took out all the other stuff like Binding Scroll and combat stuff and possible defensive stuff, because here it's not relevant to what I want to talk about. But basically here for 480 you have 5 spell, including the Rod. You have access to Hereditary Smite, Rod of Battle, so 3 buffs. Within them, Smite, I usually play a bit of shooting, so Smite is also useful from distance. And then I have another 2 range damage, meaning my rule is respected, so to say. I have 3 spell useful from distance, 3 spell useful in close combat. So I achieve what I want to do for magic for 480 points, and I have access to a very good spell, which is Wrath of God, very scary in a lot of matches. So this is also something nice. I have +1 to cast, and with the Tome attribute, makes a bit harder to dispel for the opponent. So a couple of things to keep in mind. But then I have all my eggs in one character, in one basket. And the alternative that I thought about with my list, Adept Pyro with Firebrand makes a total of 3 spells, most of them range damage, possibly Flaming Sword being a possible buff, and then I have an Apprentice Shamanism with a Magical Heirloom with a Rod of Battle. So in this second example, I have for 575 points, which is almost 100 points more than this one, access to 6 spells, possibly 4 of them being buffs, and then at least, yeah, +1 Shamanism can also be useful from range, but I'm definitely less scary from range. I have 2, in most of the case I will have 2 range damage that are a bit less effective than Tome, but then I'm a bit better in buffing combat. But for 100 point more, do I really want that? I mean, it's definitely what I wanted to say, it's definitely less balanced than the first one. The first one is indeed very good at range, because if you have Wrath of God, it's always very good range damage, and also very good buffs, because I have access to 3 buffs that are quite good with my army. Here I would say I'm a bit less scary from range, but a bit better buffing combat. So it's less balanced, obviously in some cases it will be better because more combat buff in the games where you expect more combat. It's better, obviously, but then less good from range. So is the trade-off bad? Is the trade-off worth it for 100 points? Don't think so. But obviously on the first look you say, oh, I'm being smart here, I'm not picking an adept, I have picking an heirloom and Rod of Battle, so I get 2 additional spell instead of 1 for an adept, so I'm being smart, taking Firebrand, it's also cheap and stuff like that. Yeah, it's very appealing, but when you add up, it's a lot of points. I don't have a +1 to cast, I don't have access to Wrath of God, so not sure the trade-off is any good, worth it. Then second example, I hope you don't mind, he asked me something about the list, so I decided to hide some of the stuff and still show you the magical setup, just to comment a little bit on that. So here, for 670 points, he has access to 5 spell, and these 3 characters, they have mainly, this guy could have a purpose as chaff, but I guess not early on, so you could see that as an additional role, but the rest of them, it's mainly, so I took away for 670, I took away all the special stuff, so still you need to pay for Nezib Cash, but yeah, it doesn't represent a lot of points. But basically for 3 mages that are mainly used as caster, you have only access to 5 spell, not a lot of buffs, mainly 2 buffs. You can count the breast weapon as well as a buff. Maybe versatile spell could also be counted as a buff. Maybe you can have a 3rd buff, but then you're less good at distance. So it's not that strong of a magic phase, and it's quite expensive for what you get. You don't have any master, you don't have any +1. So yeah, instead of that, you could consider what would be the trade-off. So if you take, for example, you took him away and you upgrade that guy as a master, it's not more expensive. You get an additional spell, a +1 to cast. You lose that guy that could be a piece of chaff. Okay, if you want to keep that option, I think he would be used mainly as a late game chaff. So if you want to keep that option, you can pay for 15 points and have him on the vassal steed. Then you still have the option to sacrifice the conjurer for a quite cheap price, something very similar to what you wanted to have. And then you just put him as a master, and maybe if you need more, then you have at least 1 spell more. You have a +1, your master, so I think it's better for the price. So you need really to consider when you start to have multiple casters that are adept, apprentice. Maybe some of them as apprentice have a cowboy role. For example, I really like at the moment the Prophet of Lugar on a chariot. I think for less than 300 points you have access to Toxic Breath, you can be a good chariot, and it's not a lot of more points than a normal chariot, than a Kadim chariot. It's something like maybe 50 points, 40 points more, so it's not a lot, and you have access to good spell. So I can see why you would pay that, but here in this case I don't think it's worth it to pay so many points for not a so good magic phase. I think it's quite, it's not quite good for the amount of point that you invested in those characters. So you always need to think about the trade-off. Do I prefer to have 2 casters? Are they better than a single caster as a master? Do I want to pay 3 casters? Are they better than a master and an adept, for example? And then last example is an example where we have 3 small apprentice cowboys on Wolf Chariot. As you can see, very cost effective. They are only 140 points. And then his other caster is only an adept shamanist. So yeah, if you don't consider the stuff, it's what? It's like I need to reduce almost 100 points. So it's still more than 600 points. Basically here the main issue is it's not the total of points, because paying 600 to have 3 cheap chariot characters that can be annoying is not something that annoys me too much price wise. But then the issue here is these guys are going to die. They are going to die. They are not that resilient, and the opponent knows if he targets them, basically the magic phase, then it's almost over, because then you have only 2 spells from Shamanism. So I think here that's a big issue. If he would have played instead, for example, remove one of the guy, I don't know which one, but you remove one of them, and then you upgrade him to a master, not for a lot of more points. In comparison, it's maybe like 50 points. Maybe you need to remove Crystal Ball to have that, but then you increase him to a master, then you know that no matter what happened to the cheap guys that are going to die at some points in the game, most likely, then you still have a decent magic phase. So I think that's really key when you build your magic phase. Don't be appealed only by the price to say, oh, 140, I have a fighty chariot for only 140, and I have a spell with that, so I can do a lot. I can do cast spell and then also be good in combat. But yeah, you forgot a little bit that when they die, it's going to be a big problem. And also the fact that the 3 spells that they have access to are damage spell, meaning if they go in combat, basically you have not a lot to cast after that. So you always need to keep in mind when you play this multi-purpose caster that if they die, is that a problem for my magic phase? And if they go in combat or stuff like that, do I still have a decent enough magic phase, still enough spell to cast? So I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. And yeah, my setup would be, in most of the cases, I like to have a master. In all my list at the moment, I still have a master in the list. Yeah, it's expensive, but it's expensive for a reason. Magic is very good, and at least in the lore that I like, it's worth it to pay for the access to lore, to the spell 5 and 6. So for me, it's still definitely worth it to pay, to invest points to pay for Wizard Master. And you need to think carefully when you try to build this with a lot of small casters, what you want to achieve, what happens if they die, and so on and so on. That was it, guys. I hope it was useful for you and for your list creation. Just a couple of ideas that I had after the new update. I think it's really nice that the team, the Ninth Age team, decided to go for this change. It at least opens up to a lot of build. But yeah, don't be fooled by the new this new present that we might have. Obviously, some of the build can be very appealing, but you need still to keep in mind what you want to achieve with Magic. What are your casters going to do during battle? Are they going to fight? Yes or no? What happens if they die by fighting, and so on. Thanks a lot, guys, for watching this video. I hope this was helpful for you, and I wish you a nice day. Bye bye.